Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Hickey. I have the privilege of serving as the Associate Dean for Research and Graduate Studies in the college, and also serve as Director of the Human Performance Clinical Research Lab in the Department of Health and Exercise Science. On behalf of the entire Dean's leadership team and the Planning Committee for the 2021 Research Day, I want to welcome you to today's lightning talks. Before we get started, I want to take a minute to acknowledge the remarkable breadth and depth of scholarship that's been on display in our poster session. This has been open virtually since Sunday, and it will remain open all year long. The judging is closed, and we're looking forward to making announcements about award winners tomorrow at noon in our award ceremony. But I do want to encourage you to go take your time to have a look at the range of scholarship across the college. They will be durable and available for you to access all year long. We have a remarkable variety of work that displays scholarship from faculty, staff, and students in all 8 of our academic units. I also want to take a moment to give a big shout out to CSU Ventures for being a sponsor of our virtual poster show and for assisting with setting up the online platform. It wouldn't have been possible without them, and they have been material partners in this process, and we're deeply appreciative of their efforts and helping us get connected to BitServe. So again, I want to remind you, judging is concluded. We will be making award decisions later this afternoon. We will send out invitations to awardees so that you know that you're going to be recognized tomorrow at noon. And we have another Teams meeting where we'll again celebrate the award winners in a variety of different categories. Those of you that were at the Research Day last year will recall our lightning talks, and we've once again, for this part of our program, invited one faculty member from each unit. We're delighted that this year we can also feature our 2 inaugural graduate student Dean's Fellows as they share their scholarship with the community as well. So we're looking forward to 10 lightning talks over the next hour and a half or so. Each 6-minute talk is going to be followed by a very brief short question and answer period that's going to be limited to approximately 2 minutes. And so for all attendees, I want to encourage you to post your questions into the Q&A session on this Teams live event as the speaker is delivering their talk. We will moderate those questions. Dr. Sonali, Didi, and I will serve as moderators, and we will make sure we pose the questions to each of our speakers. But given the fact that these are lightning talks with lightning Q&As, I really want to strongly encourage you to go ahead and post those questions while a faculty member is delivering their talks. I do want to point out a couple of other things as well about the nature of these talks. Several faculty members have animated slides. They've shared scripts with our IT team to drive the animation within each talk, and so we're going to do our best to make this work in terms of them actually running the show. But our central IT team is in fact handling all the slides, and so we're looking forward again to the delivery of each of these innovative talks. And so I get to start with our first speaker today. I'd like to welcome Dr. Erin Arneson. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Construction Management. And Erin will begin our lightning talks today.
Right. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah. Hi, everyone. So big picture, my research looks at the resilience of systems. So I'm looking at existing resources within supply chains and how we can smartly mobilize those to solve big problems. Some work I'm doing with my graduate student. You can see here an image of the Northeast US after Hurricane Sandy, and the areas in darkest red are where we had the most residential housing damages, so the most amount of infrastructure problems after the hurricane. So some of our research, we kind of hypothesized that, okay, any community with lots of damage to their houses is going to take longer to recover after a disaster. So hold that thought and we'll get to it in a later slide. But next slide, please. So how my work integrates with the college is really that the outcomes I'm focused on are people and the communities that they live in. So how can we improve community resilience? So big picture, we're looking at community resources before a disaster. So for construction resources, that's labor and materials. And then for socioeconomic resources of households, are people underwater in their mortgage? Are they living paycheck to paycheck? Do they have a social safety network? all of those things could make them more or less resilient when they have to fix their housing after a disaster. And so for community resilience, I'm in construction, so I'm really into the physical infrastructure. How are we going to fix buildings, roads, bridges? But also, how do we fix social cohesion in a community? We have to maintain that as well. How do we make sure that the local economy, local businesses also do well after a disaster? Okay, next slide. So in terms of impact, going back to some work my graduate students have been doing, we're looking at housing reconstruction outcomes for communities, so residential houses. And if you remember, we kind of hypothesized on that first slide that the amount of damages to houses was going to be the #1 factor that drives reconstruction, right? The more work we have to do to fix houses, the longer it will take. In our research, we took all this quantitative data and mapped it into GIS. So we're mapping the amount of resources as well as the location. So using GIS, and then we're using geographically weighted regression. So that makes the location of all the predictor factors a predictor itself in the regression analysis. Can only be done using GIS. And we found that our hypothesis was wrong, that the amount of damages was not significant in determining how long it takes the community to rebuild, that in fact it was all of those pre-disaster supply chain resources that determined how long it took to rebuild after a disaster. So the amount of labor force in your local community, the number of wholesalers, so like the number of Home Depots, how close they are to your community, and then a lot of the socioeconomic resources, household income, education level, and how much they still owed on their mortgage. So why this is so important in terms of impact is the idea that if people don't rebuild and move back into their homes within about 2 years after disaster, they tend to leave their community and never come back. And so it becomes almost impossible to have community level resilience at that point. We do have a national disaster recovery framework in the US, and it barely mentions the construction industry or like how to use pre-disaster resources or thinking that way. So trying to change the way policymakers think about dedicating money towards disasters more to the pre-disaster mitigation side. How can we change how emergency managers are thinking about this rather than just always that post-disaster cleanup, trying to quickly replace things. So thank you.
Erin, thank you very much for starting us off so elegantly. I appreciate it. I'd like to pose the first question, and it's really related to the topic of discussion yesterday. And so I wonder if you have some reflections on the impact of sort of economic disparities on resilience and recovery from natural disasters.
Yeah, so there's a lot of research going on in that area. How can we better measure how that impacts these post-disaster outcomes? But definitely anything socioeconomic, the existing conditions before disaster tend to be made worse by the disaster. And so if you're already in a community that has, low income, lack of affordable housing, all those kind of things, it makes you more vulnerable to a disaster.
Thank you for that. I'd like to pose another one if I can. This is on a bit of a parallel track, and I hope you'll sort of indulge me with this, but I'm interested in the infrastructure for supply chain as it's related to our ongoing struggles with delivering vaccines. So I know this is, again, not the central area of your work, but are there aspects of your work that can inform how we might do this better if there's a next time?
Yeah, so actually that is kind of the future of my research, is diving more into construction supply chains. We're looking at how the supply chains are impacting rebuilding after California wildfires, for example. But it's the same application, right? Like COVID caused a lot of supply chain issues globally, brought a lot of awareness to that. In construction, almost all of our metal products come from China. And so shipping them over when you have closed ports, you're going to see escalated prices, a slowdown in how quickly you can mobilize materials. And so it'd be the same for vaccines. the more global your supply chain is, the harder it is to manage, and it becomes kind of impossible to be to effectively manage that complexity without a really great plan in place beforehand.
Indeed, thank you. One last question, if I may, and then we're going to have to move on. I'm curious if your wildfire research interests are going to extend to the Front Range. We obviously have sort of proximal impact, and I wonder if you've had opportunities to think about collaborations locally.
Yeah, so fortunately, our group, we were funded with a small seed grant from the CHHS group, so for sustainability. So we're looking at sustainable supply chains in Colorado as part of that project. Specifically for just roofing, the roofing industry, because that's a big component of the house in terms of cost and time, and a unique material supply chain. But that would be the same as anywhere else in the US, right? How are you going to manage rebuilding when everyone is competing for the same resources?
Well said. Erin, thanks so much. We really appreciate your presentation, and we look forward to hearing more about your scholarship. I'm now going to take a moment to introduce our second speaker, but I want to remind again our attendees we have a live event Q&A, and I encourage you at any time to post questions into that stream, and we can make sure we get them delivered to our speakers. Our next speaker is Dr. Kristen Morris, an assistant professor in the Department of Design and Merchandising. Dr. Morris.
Hello, everybody. I'd like to take a minute just to introduce myself. And so, like Dr. Hickey said, I'm in the Department of Design and Merchandising, and my area of teaching is product development. My research specializations really focus on advanced design and production technologies, inclusive design, and design for underserved communities. Specifically, in my research, I aim to uncover research-based design solutions that enhance the ability, health, and well-being of every apparel user. So today what I'm going to talk to you about is one stream of my research, which is the slide you see here on adaptive apparel. The adaptive apparel market is largely untapped. And what adaptive apparel is essentially mass market clothing that is designed with features that address the needs of people with disabilities while also still being fashionable and coveted by the non-disabled community. In the US, there are about 41 million people, or roughly 13% of the population, that reported having a disability in the 2019 census. And of this community, almost 30% of the people reporting with disabilities have an ambulatory disability, or they have difficulty with independent living and self-care. And so my research aims to address these issues through research, product design, and product development. So the main problem that we see within the adaptive apparel is that mass market apparel producers often ignore the apparel needs of any consumer group that doesn't fall into their vision of their quote unquote ideal target market. And so frankly, mass market apparel is made for non-disabled people. And the apparel technologies, the systems, the processes used to produce garments, they're not set up to accommodate adaptive features that are wanted by the disability community and diverse consumer groups. So in my opinion, there's not enough awareness about the disability community and the adaptive apparel industry. So brands aren't necessarily recognizing the market, and they definitely don't understand the impact that when we design clothing that doesn't have an inclusive design component to it, the impact that has on the disability community. So despite increasing conversations and education around disabilities and the need for adaptive apparel, we have only seen a handful of brands and retailers kind of go into this area and enter this research space. I think for me, one of the biggest obstacles that I've observed in working on this topic is that there's a lack of education and understanding around the disability community with these apparel brands. And therefore, my research engages people from the disability community and the apparel industry to address the difficulties addressed above and the product and produce research-based design solutions and best practices to kind of help us overcome this, I guess, challenge that I've outlined here about adaptive apparel. So if we could go to the next slide. Thanks, Jen. So the question is, how does adaptive apparel research exemplify the college's visions and pillars of excellence? And the research that I'm performing right now is really helping advance this vision by attacking, I guess, for lack of a better word, or reducing barriers created by clothing for people with disabilities in order to promote health and well-being of individuals. One example of a current research project that I've got going on is a study with people with paralysis on developing adaptive sports apparel and outerwear to help reduce the apparel and quote unquote gear related barriers to participation in sports and recreational activities. And so we're conducting interviews this semester to kind of identify the problem, and then the next stage will be to produce design solutions. And kind of the other aspects of this research is definitely a community-facing aspect of it, and then also I try to incorporate these principles into my teaching as well. So we're working on a website called the Inclusive Innovations Lab, which will be the community-facing arm of my research to promote resources to the disability community. And these can be things like instructions on how to modify your existing mass market apparel to work for you. And it'll also be a repository for research reports, including graduate student research and presentations. And so, like I mentioned earlier, it's an important aspect of what I do to incorporate inclusive design and adaptive apparel research into my teaching. So the product development capstone course develops an adaptive product line throughout the semester. And I do think it's incredibly important as part of kind of this education to really introduce these concepts of inclusive design and adaptive apparel to the next generation of product developers who will be entering the apparel industry. So as you can imagine, there's tremendous opportunity for cross-disciplinary collaborations with occupational therapy, health, exercise science, ergonomics, so on. And I am looking for collaborators, so thank you for this platform to promote this as part of that. So please let me know if you're interested. So go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And so in this final slide, the question is, what is the impact of this research? Well, what I do, my role as an academic is to collect the primary research and do kind of the hard work and heavy lifting of collecting data that I use to help develop best practices and models on how to integrate the voice of the consumer into the design process and best practices for technology integration to drive product innovation. So these practices will hopefully alter how the industry views the disability community, designing for this community, and even impact the methods and processes by which clothing is produced. And then ultimately, this research it also has benefit for the disability community by providing more choice and greater variety from a mass market apparel perspective that reflects the individual consumer's needs and wants and also their personal identity. So ultimately, this research, I think, has tremendous ability to impact how people see disability, increase awareness, and reduce stereotyping and stigmatization for the community. So I think that's it for today, and I'm happy to have any questions. So thank you.
Kristen, thanks so much for a really engaging talk. I appreciate it. Let me start with a question from the audience. Given the huge market for adaptive apparel, would designing and marketing adaptive apparel be a money-making proposition for brands? And a related question is, what are the barriers to entry for brands for this market?
Yeah, so I didn't put the statistic on my slides, but the disability community has quite a bit of disposable income, and Coresight Research Group has valued the adaptive apparel market in the billions, so with a B. And so I think for so long, because of stereotypes, the disability community has been looked at as not having disposable income to be able to spend on things like clothing and apparel. And so one of the greatest barriers that I've come across in entering into this space is risk, right? So the risk of going into a new market or the risk of quote unquote producing new product. And really the kind of the crux of adaptive apparel is that we're not creating anything new or entirely different. So we're not segmenting, you know, adaptive apparel off to the side of what the brands normally offer. What we're looking at is small minor modifications to existing product line that reflect the brand identity in and of itself. So this can be things like adding buttons to like your center front plackets instead of having buttons, but it still looks like it has buttons, so it still looks like a normal button-up shirt. Adding zippers or pulls in the waistband to give people easier dressing on-off features, and just things like that. So I think when it comes to the brands, the barriers are real for them, but also if they kind of switch their mindset on how they look at the adaptive apparel versus their current lines, it should be adaptive apparel with their current lines. And I think that will help reduce some of that barrier to entry.
That's great. Thank you so much. We've got time for one more brief question and brief response. Does your research encompass children? It would seem that adaptive clothing that would give children with disabilities more independence and ultimately help them develop a sense of empowerment could extend to other areas of their life.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of the two areas that have the biggest potential, I think, are people that are aging. So the aging population, as we know, is going to be a huge market as the years come on. And then there is a large gap in the market for like the 30-year-old group. We do see not quite a bit, but relatively quite a bit of approaches for children's wear. So I think if we're looking at it from like where the gap is, children is kind of a thing that's on people's radar. So Target and Tommy Hilfiger have gone at that. But yeah, absolutely, children's wear. We don't discriminate on age at all. You know, I think there's enough space and entry points to all of this that really can make an impact on people's lives, regardless of age. So.
That's great. Thanks so much, Kristen. We appreciate your time today, and I'll move to our next speaker now. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Megan Mueller, an assistant professor in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition. Megan.
Great, thank you so much for the introduction. So today I'll be talking a little bit about some of the work I'm doing and have been doing in the restaurant setting. And the reason that restaurants are so important is because about a third of kids and a third of adults eat out at fast food restaurants on any given day. And that's just fast food. It's not even all the other places we can eat out at. And when individuals do eat out in the restaurant setting, they tend to eat foods that are higher in calories, saturated fat, sodium, and added sugars. So all things from a health perspective that we would like to see less of. And so it's an important environment with which to target childhood obesity. And a lot of my work is really focused on thinking about ways, because there are a lot of reasons why families might want to eat out, and to really meet those families where they are, thinking about ways to increase the demand for healthier items within this setting, and also the supply of healthier menu items within this setting. And my work really uses a systems-oriented and framework and multi-pronged approach, as is shown here. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the examples of projects that I'm doing in each of these areas. So the first bubble, if you could go ahead and click, this is the You're the Mom campaign, which is a social marketing campaign aimed at empowering low-income moms to choose healthier foods for their children. It involves lots of things within the community. And it's part of some of the work I was doing at Tufts, really trying to empower moms to choose healthier options for their kids, like water over soda, other things other than French fries, things like that. My lab is starting to do some work on advertising, which obviously often promotes less healthy items and may counteract some of these community nutrition efforts to promote healthier items. And as a part of this work, we're really looking into who is targeted by these advertising dollars and how has spending changed over time, especially in communities of color versus white communities. And then the next example are these external nutrition policy efforts, which my work and some of the work of my colleagues has shown has been associated with restaurants offering lower calorie items, for example, or on their kids' menus, more healthy sides like fruit and vegetable sides and non-sugary beverages. So really thinking about how we can leverage these external policies to promote healthy changes in this space. Another example of an external nutrition policy is, next click, the healthy beverage policy, which is it's the healthy default beverage policy, which is a policy campaign that's happening nationwide. This is an example from California, which has the first statewide policy in the nation. But even within Colorado, the Healthy Beverage Partnership, which is a consortium of 5 local public health agencies, is working within communities within Colorado to promote these types of the passing of these types of policies. And I'm collaborating with them in a community engaged project to help evaluate these policies and think about the dissemination of these types of policies statewide, which obviously would just make it easier for kids to get non-sugary beverages automatically. So it essentially, these types of policies take off soda from kids' menus. So it just makes it easier for them and promotes healthier choices on kids' menus. And then some of the work that I'm doing right now in the internal company commitments include looking at companies' commitments to health through their corporate social responsibility reports. This is work funded by the American Heart Association. So we're really trying to understand what are the efforts that companies say they're committed to through their CSR efforts, their corporate social responsibility efforts, and is this actually translating to what they're offering on their menus. And then within that, we see these Kids Live Well initiatives, which is just an example of what the corporate social responsibility efforts might look like in this space. Next slide, thank you. Great. And in terms of integration into the college mission and vision, my work is really targeting thinking about ways to promote healthier communities and healthier people. And this is important because within restaurants, it's really easy to get to McDonald's. About half of all of Americans live within 3 minutes of a McDonald's. I calculated I actually definitely live within 3 minutes of a McDonald's. So it's really easy to get to these places. They're ubiquitous in our neighborhoods and our environments. And you know, it's not exactly the picture of health. So really thinking about ways to work within the restaurant setting so that it's easier to eat healthy when we eat out, because they are, you know, so prevalent in our communities. And then go ahead and click to the next image. At the same time, restaurants are disproportionately increasing their advertising spending in communities of color over time. So this is that work that I'm doing with my lab on advertising, where we see about a 5 percentage point increase from 2012 to 2018 in per capita advertising spending in minority communities compared to white communities. And we also see this really interesting spatial distribution of changes over time in per capita advertising spending, where it really sort of maps on to the stroke belt in the South. There's a lot of increase in advertising spending from restaurants in the South. And then in doing some of this healthy default beverage work and thinking about ways to increase the availability of healthier options on restaurant menus, my lab is trying to make healthier foods more normative and the easy choice, especially for children, because often what you see are things like French fries and soda on restaurant menus that are automatic. And so making ways or thinking of ways to make soda and fries and chicken fingers and pizza and burgers and all those things that we think of as kid food not seem the norm. Next slide, please. And my work is really rooted in public impact. It's a direct goal of my research. So in the work that I'm doing with corporate social responsibility, I'm really trying to understand how are communities, or excuse me, how is community nutrition and public health engaging with the industry? And when they do engage with the industry, is it only resulting in things like statements on a web page that don't have a lot of clout? And then similarly, the work that I'm doing with the Healthy Beverage Partnership to really think about ways to promote the adoption of these healthier default beverages in the restaurant setting. And that's it. Thank you.
Megan, thanks so much for your talk. I appreciate it. I'll start with a question. I think we're all aware of sort of economic barriers, right, that are going to be part of the challenge we have to overcome here. I wonder, though, if you can comment on parallel reflections on health literacy barriers as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So some of my work is looking at sort of the inclusion of things like health and nutrition claims on restaurant menus, because often what we'll see is there's these descriptors that restaurant items have that are sort of indicative of health, like, you know, things like natural or organic that, you know, the health community sort of knows doesn't necessarily indicate something's healthier. But even when something says it's low fat, it doesn't necessarily mean it's low calorie or lower in sugar or things like that. And so as part of that work, I'm really interested in looking at whether or not health literacy levels can help mitigate the confusion around those sorts of, you know, descriptors that restaurants use within this space. And then also, I think it speaks to some of the work I'm doing with the corporate social responsibility positions and really thinking about, you know, by building up health literacy, are we sort of building up people's ability to make more informed choices about whether a restaurant really does offer healthier items or doesn't? So it's a great question.
Got a question from the audience. Are you familiar with the well building certification system and how your research can support their goals?
Well building certification, I am not. No, I know of the sustainability certifications for building, but I would be curious to learn more about the well building certification.
Perhaps we can connect you offline after we're done. I do have one other question. We just have a brief moment here. What additional role can policymakers and government play going forward in supporting people's healthy nutrition choices?
Yeah, I think, you know, government as opposed to business has more of a responsibility to the public's health, obviously, you know, whereas businesses tend to be more driven by profit margins and shareholder interests. So, you know, governments can create basically expectations for how businesses behave. I think that's really what policymaking adds to this space, is that, you know, it's sort of establishing norms within industry and what those sort of rules of engagement that are okay for society more broadly.
That's great, Megan. Thanks so much. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Look forward to introducing our next speaker. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Molly Gutilla, an assistant professor in the Department of Health and Exercise Science. Molly.
Hey, thanks, Dr. Hickey. As Matt said, my name is Molly Gutilla, and I'm an assistant professor in health and exercise science at CSU and within the Colorado School of Public Health. I'm an epidemiologist, and a year and a half ago, if we were at a party, you know, not wearing masks, and I said, I'm an epidemiologist, someone might mistake me with a skin doctor, confusing it with epidermis, or someone that studies bugs, thinking of entomology. But y'all know, thanks to COVID, the work of epidemiology and public health has moved directly into headlines, TV spotlights, and it's the subject of a ton of debate on social media. So it's been quite a year for public health, you know, and we, including me, we've truly cracked open our doors to take a deeper look at how everything from individual choice to historical systems of oppression, including racist policies and systems, influence our collective health. Now, the role and the goal of an epidemiologist is to assess risk and quantify the factors that determine our health. That top row of selfies shows some of the accessory choices I could make while I was on campus this fall. While I was teaching, I used these selfies to talk about the perception of risk and the role of an epidemiologist when it comes to measuring probabilities of disease. As a public health professional, though, I'm not only interested in using sound methods in the scientific process to quantify disease risk. The central purpose of public health science is to use data and information to develop strategies that promote and protect the health of all people. It's that mission that requires us to work in innovative ways, and it's the reason that I also identify as a public health pracademic. Pracademics are those that communicate, collaborate, and strategize on both the academic campus and the practice field. Closing the gap between public health practitioners and academics is going to require a new approach in public health. By tradition, we work with different goals. Academics primarily focus on conducting research and teaching students. Conversely, practitioners are fully immersed in the day-to-day activities of their public health programs. They have little time to conduct research or broadly disseminate lessons learned from working in community. Academics are the type of people that excel at developing explicit knowledge. That's knowledge that's formal, that's systematic, that we gain from reading books and papers. Practitioners, on the other hand, they develop great tactical knowledge that's gained by observation and true hands-on experience. By working in both areas, though, pracademics, we can leverage both of these knowledge types and create new understanding, create new ways of working that engage closely with communities in determining public health solutions. Next slide, please. Thank you. The College of Health and Human Sciences is really centered on health and well-being. We all know more than ever that if we are not safe and we are not healthy, then we can't learn and we can't reach our maximum potential or impact. In my research groups, we are working to understand and ensure conditions that are safe and healthy for all, especially for groups that have experienced systemic and historical barriers to reaching their greatest level of health. I'm really fortunate to work along others that are skilled in various methods of community health assessment, but importantly, are really focused on contributing to health justice. Now, you'll know and can imagine that I don't work in isolation on any of these projects, and I owe a ton of credit to students and faculty and collaborators that I'm working with on these three examples. The research project shown on the far left is a project in collaboration with the CDC to observe COVID-19 face covering behaviors on campus. This work includes 66 colleges and universities across the country, and our team is working closely with university communications and the social norming group to move these observational data directly into messaging and information for action. That middle example of work involves faculty members from across campus and points to what we know about public health. That is that it's local, it's place-based, and that we are connected and influenced by both our social and our physical geography. Studies such as this help us to prepare for public health response and to engage in thoughtful distribution of public health resources. The example given on the right is led by actually a graduate student in systems engineering. It's an image showing a systematic review that we're working on. It's aimed at understanding how public health borrows and uses systems thinking, and to consider both how these systems serve us and potentially how they are failing us. All three of these examples of work integrate with the mission of the college. That is not only to assess health for the sake of describing population health determinants, but also to use data to push for public health action. Next slide. The central focus of a pracademic in any field is on impact. Now, it's truly a privilege of mine to spend time studying, teaching, learning about things that really matter right now, and that includes work closely with professionals that are in service of our community. The organizations in particular that we're working closely with include the Larimer County Department of Health and Environment, the Health District of Northern Larimer County, and our local Fort Collins CDC branch. We are all really committed to growing health where it happens, right? That is in our own backyard, that is within our own community. We've all got a new understanding of what essential means after this year. I know that I certainly do. And to grow something as complex as health, it's truly essential that we stay focused on impact and partner with organizations and communities that are dedicated to facilitating data to action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Molly. I appreciate that. You know, I know you've had some really unique experiences in the last year, probably things you didn't anticipate, but you know, really we're in the right place at the right time to contribute to discussions on campus and locally about how do we respond, right, to a global health pandemic. And I'm interested because I've been in so many settings in the last year about how do we best sort of apply evidence to risk assessment decisions for institutions, communities, states, countries. And you know, the parallel for me on that is how do we better inform risk tolerance? What is a household or a community willing to tolerate? Those two obviously go together. I'm interested in your reflections on that, and with special reference to, again, your experience in the last year.
Easy question, Matt. Thanks. It's a hard question. I think one of the things that we talk about is there can be a disconnect between perceived risk, perception of risk, and actual measured risk. I think in part it's on all of us as scientists to move forward science as a process, not as a product. Science as a process that's constantly changing as we learn more. And make that accessible and digestible to the people that want, it can use it to make decisions. So
I have a related question from the audience. How can academic researchers best disseminate public health best practices to the public and practitioners in the field? And just because we're old friends, I'm going to layer this for you a little bit and say, we've got some challenges about public trust in science and expertise and what have you. And so I wonder if you can think about this dissemination process in terms of also rebuilding trust in the process of science, as you so aptly describe it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of it is showing up to where people are making decisions, policymakers are making decisions. The good thing about COVID is it's easier to zoom into a city council meeting. It's easier to get to a board of director meeting. And I think part of it is just showing up and being present, and doing a lot of listening to start before we speak. But I think we need to grow our communication. That is a two-way street, and look for opportunities to get off of campus and kind of into the field, into community, to do some listening, to do some thinking, and to do some communicating about what we know in science.
Well said, Molly. Thanks so much. We appreciate your time today. I have an opportunity now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Aga Brzezinska, an assistant professor in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies. Aga.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. So in one sentence, in our lab, we study the health of the aging brain. And when most of us think about brain function, we think about the neuronal activity in brain cortex, so in the outermost layer of our brain. However, the unique part of our work is that we are looking into the white matter, so the wiring of the brain. So when we look to the left of this slide, you see that white matter is composed of very thin and long axons that are covered in myelin. And together, those myelinated axons, they act as insulated cables, and they allow communication of the entire brain. So they transmit electrical signals in our brain. And the interesting thing is that this is the level of myelination, not the number of brain cells that differentiates us from other species. However, this cable analogy also implies two things. First, that white matter may be just a passive conductor of electrical signals. And second, that it is static. So it just, after it develops in an early development, it just stays the same and only deteriorates as we grow older or if we suffer from neurodegenerative disease. And what is exciting is that in the last 10 years, research in animals have actually shown that both of those notions are not true. So first of all, we know now that white matter is playing an active role in modulation of the speed of electrical signals in our brain. So both axons and myelin can change their properties to adjust the speed of signals. And this is critical for neuroplasticity. So if we talk about learning or acquiring new motor skills, this plasticity that happens in the white matter is critical. However, whether and to what extent this white matter plasticity happens in adult people, or especially in the aging brain, is still not understood. And this is the innovative part of research we do in our lab, because we try to understand whether the aging white matter is plastic. So we use different advanced magnetic resonance imaging techniques, for example, to study how fast is white matter changing. So is the decline happening over months or years? And what is the role of lifestyle in accelerating or preventing white matter decline? And finally, we are interested in measuring plasticity, so ways to induce white matter plasticity in the aging brain. Next, please. So our research classifies as basic research, but I believe that some of our findings will have impact on science and public health and policies. So for example, using two different neuroimaging techniques, we found that white matter in healthy older adults, so no cognitive impairment, declines on a time scale of just 6 months. This is much faster than we previously expected. And I hope this will justify treating white matter as the new target for new therapies, because so far treatments targeting pathology like Alzheimer's disease pathology in the gray matter, so where the neuron bodies sit, has not yet been effective in modifying the disease. Second, we found that people who engage more in aerobic exercise or avoid excessive sedentariness have not only better health of the white matter, but also they show slower or lesser magnitude of 6 months decline. And we hope that those results in the longer term will affect public health recommendations and policies regarding minimizing the risks and optimizing protective factors against brain and cognitive decline. And finally, we have shown that physical activity such as dance or aerobic walking can reverse those declines that happen in the aging white matter over 6 months. And we hope that, of course, it has to be yet tested in independent studies, but we hope we will be able to deliver new interventions to the communities to allow them to preserve their cognitive function. Next, please. So our work integrates into the mission and vision of our college by optimizing cognitive and brain health. Currently, just in the United States, 5 million people are diagnosed with dementia. Further 7 with mild cognitive impairment, and over 40 million of people are over 65 and will experience some degree of normal age-related cognitive decline. And importantly, it is the cognitive decline, not physical disability, that is the main predictor of loss of independence in everyday life. Therefore, and it's also important to mention that those numbers and this progression is even more profound in developing countries where population aging occurs at much faster pace. So by trying to improve brain health, we hope that we'll be helping people to let them maintain their cognitive ability for longer time. And as a result, we plan to improve the independence and quality of life of individuals and their families, and relieve caregiving and economic burdens that are associated with cognitive impairment in our populations. And what is important that our focus on physical activity allows for safe, so no side effects, and inclusive interventions promoting brain and health and cognitive health and aging. So these are not pharmaceuticals that would be only available to the most privileged. And thank you.
Aga, thanks so much for a very interesting talk. I've got a question about that rapid change in white matter over the course of 6 months. Have you been able to link that to any concomitant functional deficits that are occurring at the same time?
So this is not so easy because when we test people with cognitive tasks, within 6 months and they are cognitively normal, we often just see some retest effects.
Sure.
But what we have found, actually, my student Andrea, who's presenting her poster, is that aerobic exercise-related change in white matter correlated with more positive change in memory over 6 months. So we believe that some of those white matter changes are functional.
I'm curious if it's a function and part of a resolution for your imaging techniques that's far superior than our resolution to test small differences in either motor function or cognitive function. So even if they're occurring at the same time, the sensitivity of the test on one side is not the same as it is on the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's hard to tell. I mean, yes, I love neuroimaging, but I still think in the end what we want to measure is the change in function. But hopefully by understanding more the neuronal mechanisms, and some of what we observe can be really related to function. Other things may be just related to changes maybe of water content in the brain. So neuroimaging has limitations. I think it's very important, to combine those different measurements and disciplines. That's why the project we are currently performing is also with researcher Kaigan Klee from CHHS. So I think the intersection is very important.
That's great. And I have one quick question from the audience, if I may. Are interventions effective for individuals at any age, or is there a point where cognitive decline is irreversible?
This is a great question, and to be honest, really cognitive impairment and dementia is not my specialty. I study healthy aging, but from what I would dare to say that we should not stop exercising and taking care of our healthy lifestyle. We do not know yet, but I would be rather on the optimistic side that even if we may not be able to reverse, we may still provide so-called brain reserve that will, for example, decelerate any ongoing declines. So we don't know yet, but I would say not give up. Not give up.
Here, I'll second the motion. I agree entirely. Aga, thanks so much for your presence today. We really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
It's now my opportunity to introduce our next speaker from the Department of Occupational Therapy. We have with us today Dr. Jacqueline Stevens, Assistant Professor. Jacqueline.
Good afternoon, and thank you for being here. To describe how my research is innovative, I'd like to start by providing some context. So we are exceptionally lucky to live in a state like Colorado, where we have frequent opportunities to engage in a variety of sports and recreational activities. Unfortunately, however, those activities come with some risk of concussion, which is a type of mild traumatic brain injury. You'll hear me use the words mild traumatic brain injury and concussion interchangeably throughout the remainder of my talk. The clinical assessments that are used to date to evaluate and manage concussions have some significant limitations, particularly when we're trying to determine if someone's ready to return to activity. The limitations of those assessments include a reliance on pre-injury testing, which isn't always available, or the use of objective measures that have limited applicability to real-world performance. Subsequently, return to activity often results in repeat injury, which includes repeat concussions. New empirical studies have begun to tackle the limitations of these return to activity assessments using dual task paradigms. And dual task paradigms ask an individual to do two things at a time, like moving while doing mental math. These dual task paradigms are particularly sensitive to the residual deficits from brain injury. Researchers have been able to see subtle but very significant deficits that occur from concussion. The image here, however, is a motion capture system that has been used in past dual task paradigms. This system and other lab equipment like it can be quite expensive to use, and it relies on significant time, uses significant time and expertise to administer and manage. Therefore, while this dual task research is very impactful in telling us what to look for after concussion, the procedures that are being used are not practical for everyday clinical use. This brings me to my innovative solution, which is a major component of my ongoing research. So just before coming to Colorado State University, I developed the dual task screen, which includes 2 dual tasking activities, a walking task and a hand-eye coordination task, both conducted as a single task and as a dual task where I introduce a difficult cognitive task that they have to do with the motor task. I designed the dual task screen so I could leverage the empirical findings from other dual task researchers while keeping in mind the needs of clinicians. So my dual task screen uses low cost, portable material, and can be completed virtually anywhere in under 10 minutes. More importantly, however, I expect that my dual task screen can detect the subtle deficits from concussions that place individuals at risk for repeat concussion. Therefore, in using my dual task screen, clinicians will be able to quickly and reliably identify and treat those residual deficits. I have also recently adapted my dual task screen to permit simultaneous neuroimaging so I can understand the neural correlates of dual task behavior and meaningfully contribute to the understanding of brain injury sequelae. As noted on my first slide, current return to activity assessments for concussion are limited, and return to activity often results in repeat concussions. And to note, individuals that have a history of 2 or more concussions over their lifetime are at a heightened risk for permanent behavioral, cognitive, and sleep deficits. And we've all also heard of professional athletes who have died with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. This has originated from a lifetime of head impact and injury. The end goal of my research is to reduce that risk. I believe that my dual task screen is a practical way to identify and treat the residual deficits of concussion that place individuals at risk for repeat injury. So in other words, my research is directly integrated into the overall mission of our college, as the dual task screen is an innovative part of the transformative research I conduct that is designed to optimize the long-term health and well-being of people who participate in sports and recreation by supporting engagement in meaningful occupations across the lifespan. And importantly, these meaningful occupations include healthy relationships, successful school and work performance, and the lifelong participation in valued sports and recreation activities. Therefore, I feel like my research has the potential to elicit short and long-term impact. First, and very practically, I hope that I can continue to develop my dual task screen and provide clinicians with a better measure that is, again, low cost, portable, and quick to administer. Additionally, by adapting the dual task screen to permit simultaneous neuroimaging, I'm equipped to directly contribute to the scientific understanding of brain injury sequelae. Long term, I hope that my research initiatives, including but not limited to those using the dual task screen, will revolutionize the way we evaluate, manage, and treat brain injury, and I hope that we can prevent repeat brain injury and the permanent dysfunction or death that can occur with multiple head injuries. I hope to do this not only for the professional players that I've depicted here who died with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, but also in us, in everyday individuals who could struggle with sleep or work or even play after they sustain repetitive head injuries from their valued sports and recreation activities. Thank you.
Jacqueline, thanks so much for the engaging talk. And I apologize for the echo. We'll see if we can overcome that. So I'm interested in your dual task screen. It seems like it has several advantages. It's low cost, it's readily accessible, it's sort of a short access, so the time commitment in a clinic is not significant. And if I understood you right, you hinted at the fact that you're quite confident about the sensitivity of it as well. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the sensitivity, because that really becomes kind of a home run in some ways, it seems to me.
Yeah, so we're understanding that dual task paradigms in general are much more sensitive to the ongoing deficits or the residual deficits from concussion up to weeks and even months after the injury. So the clinical assessments that we're using right now lose their sensitivity to concussion about a week or 2 after the injury, which means that they really can't tell if somebody has recovered because the instruments just aren't sensitive enough to pick up some subtle things. So our measure is really using some of that information. So we're measuring gait and hand-eye coordination, and we're using cognitive tasks that are particularly challenging. So the cognitive tasks I have people do while walking is doing a verbal fluency task, so saying as many words as they can that begin with a particular letter, or the more fun one where they have to subtract backwards by 7 from a random number that I throw at them while they're trying to throw and catch tennis balls. So we're really trying to leverage the research that others have done, but also, like I said, keeping in mind that clinicians don't have access to motion capture systems. So we use tennis balls and iPods and stuff that is readily available that most athletic trainers and doctors' offices are going to have access to, so that they can use those measures to be more sensitive without breaking the bank or asking an athlete to be there for 45 minutes for an assessment.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that. I have a question for you from the audience. Does your system depend on having a baseline result from an individual before they have a TBI, or can you see differences that are independent of intra-individual variation?
That's a great question. So one of the design features of dual task screening is that we get a baseline understanding of how a person does a single task, and then we interrupt their single task performance by doing a dual task. So we do not feel like we're inherently reliant on baseline testing. Baseline testing could certainly help us so that we knew how they did single and dual tasks before injury and then also after injury. But some of my postdoctoral work showed us some subtle motor deficits that we can look for that the athletes don't know we're testing for. And those are the kinds of things that we can introduce into our dual task measurement so that we can pick up some residual deficits of concussion without the athlete knowing that we're looking for it, which also means that if they sandbag a baseline test, it doesn't matter because we have some information that they didn't even know we were capturing.
Jacqueline, thanks so much. This is great. We have additional questions, but I'm afraid we're going to have to move on to our next speaker. So thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Daesuk Chai, Assistant Professor representing a School of Education. Daesuk.
All right, thank you. Hello, everyone. Unlike the previous ones, my presentation is about my research agenda rather than a particular study of mine. I'm Daesuk Chai in the School of Education. The title of my program is Organizational Learning, Performance and Change. I would like to highlight that because I want you to remember that we have organizational change experts and consultants here in our college. Also, the title shows the area of my research and expertise. I know I have only 5 to 6 minutes, but I really want you to try this activity. Raise your hand and point your finger to the ceiling and make circle clockwise continuously. Make sure you're making the circle clockwise. Then while you make a circle continuously, lower your hand below your chest. Are you making a circle clockwise or counterclockwise? If you follow the instruction correctly, it should be counterclockwise. What it means is that even you examine the same phenomenon depending on your lens and perspectives, particularly your cultural lens, you may interpret the same phenomenon entirely opposite or different. So this is why I'm passionate about culture. I'm originally from South Korea, and I have traveled and lived in multiple states of America. What I experienced was absolutely different from state to state. For example, when you order a beverage like Coke, depending on the state, you call it pop, soda, or Coke. In Georgia and Texas, organizational culture is hierarchical and collectivistic. On the contrary, in Michigan and Minnesota, culture is flat and individualistic. I'm talking about American culture, but can you define American culture in a few words? Absolutely not. In addition to culture, I'm passionate about developing individuals and organizations. My major human resource development, HRD, is all about developing individuals and change organizations. So before and during my PhD, I worked for and consulted several Korean conglomerates and government organizations. My job was to develop training programs and to change organizations as a change agent. Next, please. So the working experience in academic inquiry led me to research these agendas. The first one is a training and OD in an international context. Many scholars have studied OD and training, but only few conduct research about global and cross-cultural aspect of them. As the activity we engaged in the beginning, culture can explain various individual and organizational behaviors. I'm passionate about conducting research in various and cross-cultural contexts and interpret them using culture. So I have conducted research in the US, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Lebanon, and New Zealand. This is the innovative piece of my research. Another innovative piece is applying innovative tools and principles like neuroscience to the process of OD and training. Second, leadership in diverse culture context. As you may know, most leadership theories came from Western culture context. Are those leadership theories working in Asian countries? Yeah, no, maybe. So based on this question, I conducted a couple of qualitative studies exploring effective and ineffective leadership behaviors in Korea. In the future, my goal is developing a Korean local leadership theory and an instrument to measure it. The third one, expatriation effectiveness, is my favorite agenda. I'm very interested in the populations on the cultural border, immigrants, foreign workers, international students, and self-initiated expatriates like me. Interestingly, most of them are underrepresented and marginalized in the host society. Although they are the one who naturally brings diversity and inclusion, particularly cultural diversity and inclusion, to the host society and country, they're often not welcomed and discriminated. I want to study them and help them, which are well aligned with the vision and mission of our college. In terms of integration, one of the examples would be that I'm integrating adult learning theories, management theories, and psychology and sociology theories. So most of my studies are based on interdisciplinary approach. Next, please. In terms of impact, the outcome variables in my research include mental and behavioral health, well-being, and individual and organizational outcomes, which are highlighted in the vision and mission of our college. I published the peer-reviewed journal articles in each of the three agendas using both qualitative and quantitative research methods. Based on that effort, some of my studies were recognized at Academy of Human Research Development, which is my academic home. In terms of community engagement, I have worked with the Office of International Programs at CSU to conduct the research about international students' cultural adjustment and their mental and behavioral health. Also, according to OECD, cultural competency is one of the most critical competencies for future workforces. So with the biomedical engineering professors and my dear colleague Zil Zaretsky in SOE, I applied an NSF grant to design an online course for biomed undergrad students to learn diverse culture and biomed practices around the world while they interact with the biomed undergrad students and faculty members in different countries. Thanks so much for your time, and I hope to collaborate with you soon. Thank you.
Isuk, thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I want to push the conversation you ended on about cultural competency in STEM. Is this an effort to expand the vision about how one thinks about STEM disciplines from a cross-cultural perspective? Yeah. I mean, cultural competencies can be expanded into. I mean, I think it should be the core curriculum for all of the undergraduate programs. And I think we, particularly the STEM education. So that's why I contacted that particular biomedical engineering department, and then we kind of developed that online course using Zoom. And again, I want to follow up a little further because I'm also interested in the notion of, your opening illustration about our perspective on our clockwise circle. As we apply a cross-cultural perspective to adult theories of learning, I wonder again can we expand our vision? I assume adult theories of learning again are predominantly from a particular cultural perspective. Right. So how can we get a broader perspective about how individuals learn so that we do a better job as teachers and as learners? Yeah, that's a very good question, I think, because most of the even adult learning theories were, as you said, based on the Western culture context and philosophies. So I think some of the scholars are they initiated developing those adult learning theories based on Eastern cultural context as well as Eastern philosophies. So I think it's an emerging topic. So I guess
we can incorporate those Western and Eastern, and then make them generalized in the future.
So we build a better model as learners, right?
Right.
That's great. And again, just one more very quick question, if you could. I'm interested in your work with expat populations. And again, if you have reflections on how we can do a better job as a community, at whatever scale we think about seeing, hearing, welcoming, incorporating voices from that expat population into who we are, as opposed to an us and them kind of perspective.
Yeah, interestingly, CSU actually lost to 17% of the international student population. So I think Office of International Programs try to do their best to recruit more and then incorporate their cultures into the CSU. And I think they're developing some agendas, and I'm collaborating with them. So nearby, I think we'll have some initiatives and agendas.
I'm looking forward to hearing that. Thank you so much, and we appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Pleased now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Keeney, Assistant Professor in the School of Social Work. Elizabeth.
Thanks, Matt, and thanks for the invitation to be a part of this group representing our respective departments today. So few people recognize the key role that U.S. policymaking has played in creating a large unauthorized Latinx immigrant population. It is but another instance of collective historical amnesia. The majority of 11 million unauthorized immigrants, 2 in 3 of whom are Latinx, have been in the U.S. for a decade or more and are deeply rooted in ways that we don't fully have time to get into today. But despite the socio-political climate for immigrants who lack formal legal status, despite this, the socio-political climate for immigrants who lack formal legal status is very difficult, leading to social isolation, social exclusion, exploitation, pervasive fear, and psychological trauma. And not only for immigrants themselves, but through well-documented spillover effects for those who are connected to them. So one arm of my research program focuses on community-level responses that can be leveraged to address the root causes of socio-political barriers to Latinx immigrant well-being and integration. Arguably, one of the most effective tools we have at our disposal to address inharmonious social relations is intergroup interaction and exchange. Next slide. Or actually, stay on that slide, sorry about that. This arm of my research contributes several key innovative advances. At present, little is known about attitudes towards Latinx immigrant groups in relation to intergroup interaction and exposure. This omission is critical, as Latinx immigrants are one of the most negatively viewed and have replaced Black Americans as the focus of anti-minority rhetoric, according to more recent political discourse analysis. My work has demonstrated that through what is called a secondary transfer effect, cross-ethnic racial group contact has positive implications for whites' attitudes towards Latinx immigrants. I have found that a range of opportunities to traverse existing social boundaries hold promise. However, in critique of the intergroup contact theory, socially advantaged group members like whites can have positively valenced attitudes towards a group and still hold inequitable social arrangements, or at least do nothing to disrupt them. Thus, I orient my research in such a way that calls for us to move beyond mere concern for social harmony to social justice and equity aims. Another innovation of my work then is testing whether the tenets of the intergroup contact theory are at odds with or complementary to the collective action model of social change. And to do this, I examine the potential impact of intergroup contact on active ally behaviors. And that includes civic engagement, activism, and support for equity enhancing policy. I have found that this leap requires greater structural attunement and seeing individuals as nested as group members existing within historical and present systems. To support real-world application of this arm of my scholarship, the qualitative aspects of cross-group contact required to meaningfully facilitate these behaviors is critical. And this gets at questions like how much, how often, how long, under what conditions, and in what context. And much of the existing research suffers from debilitatingly crude assessment of intergroup contact. But these descriptive insights are truly critical for perceptible impact and translational science. All right, so we're on the right slide now. My research program is well aligned with our college's vision for our research mission as we collectively strive for transformative research that promotes individual and community well-being. My North Star as a scholar is to advance translational and applied science that supports the well-being of historically and currently socially marginalized populations. And this requires a shift to more inclusive communities and equity-focused policies that foster social connectedness and inclusion, trust and mutuality, and psychological well-being. Go to the next slide. Taken together, my work focuses on understanding and, importantly, responding to sociopolitical determinants of Latinx immigrant well-being and integration. As a social work scholar with an applied focus, this responsiveness is all important to me. Much of my work draws on Latinx critical theoretical perspective, a lens I extended into social work early in my career with much uptake and influence, even being used and disseminated by the National Latino-Latina Psychological Association and National Association of Social Workers. And consistent with this perspective, much of my work is intended to influence policy outcomes, another way that I get at the origins of hardship and oppressive structures. One of the ways I better ensure my work informs and impacts policy is through a partnership approach to research and the use of community-based participatory action research. Two of my current projects focus on sociopolitical factors influencing Latinx immigrant family well-being, and each are steered by a community advisory board made up of a mix of directly impacted folks and their cross-group allies. So this second arm of my research, in its present manifestation, directly maps onto current policy advocacy efforts of two coalitions in Colorado that are working to influence local, state, and federal policy. This work then has been strategically positioned to have direct community impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate your talk. I'm interested in your experience with intergroup connectedness efforts, right? It seems to me in one sense we're trying to sort of break down some ideological or cultural barriers, right, by putting some groups together. When we think about barriers to making that happen, some of them strike me as maybe written into law, written into cultural practices. Some of them are written into individual households and individuals. And so how do we take deliberate steps to remove the barriers so that the activation energy to make that connection is minimized?
Absolutely, and that's a great question because my research has found that it's even those organic opportunities in the community to have these quick, nothing terribly novel, but these quick interactions, and those add up over time to impact people's intergroup attitudes. And as my research does, go farther to look at policy attitudes and willingness to engage in collective action. And so I think that one of the things that we need to do is target the extent to which that we are socially segregated in society. Our levels of educational segregation, housing segregation have truly gone up in recent decades. And I have back here a really foundational book that describes that, and it's really compelling and influences my work tremendously. And so I think that, again, that just goes along with the need to see some policy changes to support this work.
So if I'm hearing you right, it's a combination of policy changes and organic level willingness to get out the door, right?
Sure, absolutely. Willingness to interact with people across group lines. Okay. But I think that the part of the barrier to that is the structural impediments that exist. And so that's where I target my work.
That's great. And from the audience, I've got a question for you. Have you considered using eco-developmental theory to frame your research work, as this theoretical framework is mainly focusing on Latino populations?
Right. So I've used Bronfenbrenner's eco-developmental model in quite a bit of my work, if that's what the audience members is referring to. But absolutely, that's an important one to consider these systems and layers of influence and the ways in which the individual influences those systems and is influenced by.
Great. And one other from the audience before we have to close. Has your research looked at cross-group contact among children in schools?
So there has been a lot of research on cross-group contact in schools. And so there's a really effective method called the jigsaw method. And what it requires teachers to do is to strategically pair students into groups where they each are experts and leaders in their own right, and that that context in which students can engage can really change intergroup attitudes among school-age children. And so there are tremendous opportunities to harness that for social good. And so right now my research has not looked at that. I have focused more on community level interactions with young adult populations primarily.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your thoughtful presentation and the interaction in the Q&A. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
I now have the opportunity to introduce two additional speakers. Our first one from our Dean's Fellowship cohort is Allie Cavalier from the Department of Health and Exercise Science. Allie.
Hi, thank you so much. I am a second-year PhD student in the Health Plan Biology Lab. We study healthy aging using a variety of methods, including bioinformatics, which is computational analysis of large DNA or RNA or protein sequencing data sets. Today, I'm going to be talking about my fellowship work studying chemotherapy and brain aging. So approximately 1/3 of cancer patients will receive chemotherapy as part of their treatment plan. And one of the most frequently reported side effects of chemo is this chemotherapy-induced cognitive impairment, colloquially termed chemo brain. And while we know that chemo brain is real, how chemo leads to this dysfunction is still largely unknown. One possible explanation is that the chemo drugs are having harmful effects on cells in the brain, even though they are not thought to be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. But our data and others suggest that it actually might. So if these drugs can really affect the brain, that could be clinically relevant because we may not know how exactly it's happening, but we can use this big data approach to look at the changes that are occurring at the gene expression level. And on the next slide, I'll show a little bit more about how we do that. So studying chemo brain in people can be really difficult because we don't always have access to baseline measurements, and we would obviously never give chemo to people that don't need it. So by studying potential mechanisms of chemo brain in cell culture and mouse models shown on the left, we are able to get a better understanding of the underlying processes, which can then be translated back to the clinical setting. An important reason for this work is that chemo and its side effects take a massive toll on patients. And if we can figure out why this damage is occurring, we might be able to prevent it and improve quality of life. Older adults are at a particularly high risk for these complications, and the risk of cancer itself and subsequent chemo treatment increases drastically with age. This translational approach, which is sometimes referred to as bench-to-bedside research, presents a real opportunity to improve quality of life of these individuals, which fits with the vision and mission of our college. We are in an excellent spot to study this here at CSU because we have our very own Center for Healthy Aging, shown there in the middle, which is geared towards education and engagement. It's equipped with an informational website for sharing knowledge with the general public so that it might be useful to those in need. And there's some blog posts taken from the webpage there, so anyone can see this and we can share all of the information we acquire with the public. On the next slide is some pilot data showing the potential impact of this work. So we've started studying chemo brain through this bioinformatics approach, looking at gene expression changes in the brain. And I know this is a really complex figure, but the gist of it is that treating mice with this common chemo drug doxorubicin, or doxo abbreviated above, induces something that at the genome or RNA level looks like accelerated brain aging. This Venn diagram shows the types of genes that changed in the brains of young mice treated with this chemo drug doxo, old mice, and importantly, old humans. And what we see is that there is an overlap in chemo-associated and age-associated gene expression changes, suggesting that the damage done to the brain by chemo treatment may be accelerating brain aging as it relates to brain structure and function. So now we've gone back into the lab to test some potential nutraceuticals, which are bioactive food ingredients like urolithin A, shown below, which is found in pomegranates, that might actually be able to prevent these changes, which is important because that's something that we could translate back to people. And urolithin A has already been shown to be safe in humans for other types of research. So this next phase of nutraceutical work looks really quite promising. And I'm currently investigating the potential protective effects of urolithin A in human cells to protect against doxorubicin damage. And I'll hopefully have more data on it the next time I talk to you. Thank you.
Allie, thanks so much for your presentation. And I have to say, it's a great pleasure to see you. It's been far too long. Thanks for coming out to join us today. I have a question about central nervous system access of chemotherapeutic agents, whether it's Doxo or any other. Do we have any evidence? Is your group working on notions of how do we distinguish whether it's a direct effect of a doxorubicin or a secondary metabolite of the agent itself, or if you'll indulge a three-layered question here, can Doxo induce the production of endogenous metabolites that can cross the blood-brain barrier and then act in a neurotoxic fashion?
Well, the simple answer that I have for you is it depends. But there is some, it's limited because, we don't have access to human brain tissue to do this, but there's some limited evidence from mass spec showing that small amounts of this drug are getting into brains of rodent models, and we actually have brains sent down to the Anschutz core for mass spectrometry right now. We're waiting to hear back on that, but there's some evidence showing that small amounts get into the brain. But even those small amounts, if they're able to cause these drastic changes, that could be really meaningful. Alternate metabolites, I haven't looked into that a whole lot, but I think there is some, it's like a doxorubicinol metabolite that is thought to be, maybe it's the most abundant, but I don't know exactly about the activity in the brain or if it can cross the blood-brain barrier.
Let me ask a follow-up if I can. In culture, is the sensitivity of neurons to Doxo different than peripheral tissues like heart or skeletal muscle or liver, so that we would have evidence that even a tiny amount entering the central nervous system is clinically relevant because of the degree of sensitivity?
So that is kind of next up on the docket. I've been doing my initial experiments in human fibroblasts, so skin cells, because I have had to do a lot of translating this from a mouse or a human into cell culture. It's really quite difficult to determine the right dosage. So I have done this in human fibroblasts, and it seems to be it doesn't like kill them right away, which kind of makes sense because when you get chemo, you don't just get one dose, you get repeated exposures over time. So I'm expecting that neurons will be more sensitive than, say, muscle cells, cardiomyocytes, just because they can't really divide to dilute the issues that are caused by this drug. But that remains to be seen.
I shall stay tuned. You have my word. I have a question from the audience. How are nutraceutical therapeutics administered to patients?
So to patients, there's a this urolithin A compound has already been tested in, I believe, just like pills, like capsules full of powdered isolated urolithin A. There's a few different urolithins, but A is determined to be the most bioactive, and they just give it orally. There's like mouse models, and they think they give it in the drinking water.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
We're introducing our next speaker. Our second Dean's Fellow in our inaugural class is Reagan Miller from the Department of Human Development and Family Studies. Reagan.
Hi, thank you so much. So with respect to innovation, one area I've been able to focus on, thanks to the CHHS Dean's Doctoral Fellowship, is understanding mindfulness interventions for adolescents exposed to chronic stress. So what we know is that adolescents exposed to chronic stressors like financial instability and interpersonal violence are at greatest risk for developing mental health problems like anxiety and depression, and stress-related impairments in physical health like worsening insulin resistance. Chronic stress likely impacts how you regulate your emotions, which can lead to these problems. And fortunately, our research suggests that mindfulness training might actually be able to help improve these mental and physical health outcomes. And when I say mindfulness, I mean paying attention to the present moment with non-judgment. And according to the mindfulness stress buffering hypothesis, maintaining greater mindfulness in the face of stress may actually protect people from these declines in health. However, we've found that when mindfulness is untrained, this relationship for adolescents might not exist. So this leads us to what we don't know, or as many researchers like to call it, gaps in the literature. So we don't know if there's a difference between trained mindfulness and untrained mindfulness. There's also very limited research on how these relationships translate to adolescents' daily lives and in moments when they're stressed. So in other words, a lot of existing research is low in ecological validity and high in recall bias because it asks participants to report on how they previously felt on certain measures. So this is where our novel question really comes into place. Does a mindfulness-based intervention compared to a control allow adolescents to be more mindful and regulated and in moments when there's a stressor? And does this ultimately lead to better mental and physical health? So not only is this question novel, but we intend to take an innovative approach to answer it by using something called ecological momentary assessment, or EMA, which uses real-time intensive repeated measurements in daily life to provide ecologically valid data. So what this looks like is we'll send teenagers a message on their phones at random times throughout the day to answer questions on how they're feeling in that very moment. So with this, we'll get momentary level data, which can tell us exactly how mindful and regulated someone is during a time of potential stress. And although EMA can be successfully implemented with adolescents, it's never before been implemented in an experimental investigation of a mindfulness-based intervention for teens. And then to analyze this data, we also intend to use advanced statistics like multi-level structural equation modeling to investigate that momentary and individual level change. This research aligns with the College of Health and Human Sciences vision, mission, and values in many different ways. So we've designed this study to understand regulatory processes at the daily and momentary state level, and this information will help us to optimize health and well-being of adolescents facing those chronic stressors and within the community that they live. The mission of this research is to ultimately promote adaptive mental and physical health of at-risk adolescents, and these improvements are expected to have lasting impacts on the communities that they live in. In doing this, we aligned ourselves with many of the values upheld by CHHS, such as community engagement, teamwork and collaboration, commitment to diversity, integrity, and social justice, just to name a few. And this work is currently based within a community-based mentoring program for at-risk adolescents called Campus Connections, which is based on campus, where we plan to randomize half of the adolescents to receive mentoring with a mindfulness component, and the other half will receive mentoring as usual. We are also currently working and collaborating with multiple departments like the Human Development and Family Studies Department, as well as the Department of Psychology, and multiple universities like CSU, Johns Hopkins, and the University of Armed Services to produce this rigorous and innovative research. And finally, this work has several implications for the community, science, and practice. In terms of the community, this research is intended to ultimately improve mental and physical health among at-risk adolescents in our local community, especially during times of high stress. These improvements are expected to have lasting impacts on the overall community, as adolescent mental and physical health is not only known to impact the individual, but also adults, teachers, and the community that interact with the adolescent. This work will also help us understand exactly how mindfulness-based interventions improve health by focusing on those theoretical mechanisms of change, emotion regulation, and mindfulness. And this work will also ultimately support those full theoretical models of change. And in terms of practice, we know that the implementation of mindfulness in schools, during therapy, and in after-school mentoring programs can help to promote health and well-being. And the current research will further these implications by providing information about whether or not mindfulness training can help at-risk adolescents during those times of high stress. And I just want to thank the College of Health and Human Sciences, as well as my mentors, Dr. Lucas Thompson, Dr. Shoemaker, and Dr. Prince, for their support in this research. Thanks.
Reagan, thank you so much, and congratulations to both of you. We're delighted that we can look forward to celebrating you two as our first cohort as we move forward. So I've got a question from the audience. Have you considered potential moderators or mediators of the effect of mindfulness interventions on mental health? And if so, how have you or do you propose to address such moderation or mediation effects?
Yeah, that is a great question. And so those theoretical mechanisms of change, the mindfulness and the emotion regulation, we're looking at those mediators to see, okay, how does the mindfulness intervention translate to these improvements in mental and physical health? And right now, we're also looking to see, we have a bunch of data from pre-COVID and mid-COVID with this mindfulness-based intervention, and we're looking to see how they change those effects. And so we're looking at things like parental warmth, parental conflict, food insecurity, and just a bunch of different measures related to COVID to see how that might change things as well. And I think you might be muted.
I almost got through the entire event without doing that. So. Murphy's Law, right?
Okay.
I'm interested in how mindfulness is conceived of or operationalized in adolescents as opposed to adults. Is it really an identical construct, or is it a different animal altogether?
Yeah, so the definition that I kind of work off of is one created by John Kabat-Zinn, which is the one that I talked about in the beginning, of the present moment attention with the non-judgmental awareness. But what we're finding is that it might potentially look different in adults and in adolescents when it's especially untrained, just because the adolescent brain isn't fully matured or developed yet. And so it might actually require that training. And so hopefully this research will be able to clarify that just a little bit.
Reagan, thanks so much for that. And again, thanks for coming to join us today. We really appreciate it. Congratulations to you and Allie.
Thank you.
You bet. Well, this concludes our lightning talks for 2021. I want to thank all of our faculty and our two Dean's Fellows for coming and joining our celebration today and sharing their innovative research. And I also want to thank all of our attendees. I do want to remind all of you we have an opportunity to gather together one more time tomorrow afternoon at noon as we'll celebrate the award winners from our poster competition. So we look forward to seeing you again tomorrow at noon. And again, thanks so much for your attention. We appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of the day.